and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, another failed DPRK missile launch just hours before a senior official arrived in Beijing for talks. Is the DPRK inching closer to full nuclear capabilities? And after a U.S. zoo shot and killed an endangered silverback gorilla to save the life of a 4-year-old boy who had fallen into the enclosure, a fierce debate has broken out about who is to blame. And we begin today's show with the DPRK missile test on Tuesday, which, according to the South Korean military, likely failed. This is the latest in a string of high-profile failures from Pyongyang. 1 day later, envoys from the United States, Japan, and South Korea met in Tokyo to discuss potential methods to halt DPRK's continuous missile tests. And Chinese President Xi Jinping also met a higher-ranking envoy from the DPRK in Beijing. Despite the failure of DPRK's missile launches, concerns have grown over tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Take a look at this.
A failed test. The DPRK attempted to fire a ballistic missile off its east coast Tuesday, but the launch appears to have failed, according to South Korea's military. Seoul and Tokyo have expressed their disapproval of the test.
오늘 북한의 미사일 발사 시도는
Today's missile launch test by the DPRK is an act of ignoring repeated warnings by the international community, urging it to stop additional provocations that cannot be tolerated.
Though there is no direct security threat, Japan has put its military on alert. Washington worries that the fourth in a series of high-profile failures shows Pyongyang pushing quickly toward the goal of a nuclear-tipped missile that can reach America's mainland.
The United States strongly condemns North Korea's missile tests. These actions and North Korea's continued pursuit of ballistic missile and nuclear weapons capabilities pose a significant threat to the United States, our allies, and to the stability of the Asia-Pacific region.
1 day after the alleged failed missile launch, delegates from the U.S., South Korea, and Japan in charge of the DPRK issues met in Tokyo. The three sides have agreed to increase pressure on Pyongyang, urging it to halt provocative acts.
I
believe our biggest challenge now is to urge the DPRK to change their way of thinking so as to take meaningful action towards denuclearization by implementing the sanction properly.
As tensions run higher, China has called on Pyongyang and Seoul to make efforts to safeguard peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula.
UN Security Council resolutions have made clear stipulations on the DPRK nuclear issue. The situation on the Korean Peninsula is complicated and sensitive at present. China urges both sides to avoid actions that could escalate tensions, so that they can work together to maintain peace and stability on the peninsula.
On Wednesday, Chinese President Xi Jinping met a high-ranking envoy from the DPRK, Ri Su-yong, who heads the ruling Workers' Party of Korea's International Department. President Xi urged all parties on the Korean Peninsula to maintain calm and restraint. The situation on the Korean Peninsula has deteriorated after the DPRK carried out a nuclear test in January. Since then, numerous missile tests have been carried out. The DPRK's actions going forward remain unpredictable.
For more on the latest discussion related to DPRK's missile tests and also DPRK's envoy into China, we are joined here in the Beijing studio. Mr. Yang Xiyu, great to have you, sir. Senior fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, and also quite instrumental when putting together the six-party talks years ago. And also join us from Seoul in South Korea, we are having Ms. Do Young Kim, visiting senior fellow with the Korean Peninsula Future Forum. Joining us from Washington, D.C., inside the United States, we have Mr. Ivan Eland, the senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Welcome to the three of you. First of all, Mr. Yang, I have to begin with you because the latest news is suggesting that the Chinese President Xi Jinping just met with the DPRK envoy, Mr. Ray, coming into China. Of course, Mr. Ray, according to international press coverage, was talking about a permanent nuclear policy from DPRK. What exactly would that mean for China?
Well, first of all, this visit by DPRK delegation was designed to implement in routine way to the party-to-party exchange mechanism For example, after our Chinese Communist Party's 18th conference, we sent a high-level delegation to Pyongyang to brief the 18th Party's conference. And this time, this is their turn. They sent a high-level delegation to Beijing for briefing the results of the 7th Congress.
Of the Workers' Party.
Of the Workers' Party. So that is a routine visit. However, on the current situation, the highlight is obviously is that the nuclear issue. And you're right, some international say Mr. Ri repeat the so-called permanent nuclear policy. That's nothing new since 4 years ago when the young leader took office because of the Beijing strategy. However, in the meeting, Xi Jinping also pointed out China's policy on the Korean Peninsula was and is unswerving. The so-called unswerving include 3 points.
All right.
Number 1, denuclearization. And then number 2, no war. And then number 3, no chaos. From a long time, it is not clear they changed their position. But China has never changed our position as unswerving, consistent.
All right, Mr. Eland, I look at you on the big screen, listen very attentively. What do you make of the latest visit by the DPRK envoy to Beijing, and also the statements coming from both sides, from Pyongyang and Beijing, about this latest visit, coming from the Washington perspective?
Well, I do think that the North Koreans are being provocative because they're taking this opportunity at the time of this visit to China to do this missile test and say that the North Korean nuclear program is permanent. And I think that's a challenge to China. They're saying, hey, we're going to, despite these sanctions, additional sanctions, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, and you know, whether you like it or not. And so I think it's a challenge to China. And I was surprised that the Chinese leader met with the North Korean envoy under those circumstances.
Well, as Mr. Yang just indicated, the circumstances is after every Congress party, the party Congress rather, the two sides would brief
yes,
one
I
another.
understand
That
it's
is,
a
pretty much
routine. It's a routine to do this after a conference, but the North Koreans have been very provocative in doing this missile test, saying the nuclear program is permanent. And I think it's a challenge to China. So I'm surprised that the Chinese leader would see the envoy. Certainly, other people in China would meet with him, but whether the leader needs to meet with him is another story, and I think that's surprising.
Ms. Kim, on the other hand, what can be the reactions coming from all sides, both from South Korea, from the United States, and of course from China and others involving in the six-party talks toward the latest situation? Can Seoul and Washington take actions in order to approach Pyongyang at this moment for further possibility of discussion regarding the Korean Peninsula and the nuclear issue?
Well, right now it's pretty clear, and what's been made clear ever since the Nuclear Security Summit in Washington is that the U.S., Korea, and Japan have all agreed that right now the time is pressure. And the logic behind their unified stance right now for pressure seems to be the logic that in order to have effective diplomacy, there needs to be effective pressure to use as leverage to bring North Korea back to any sort of discussion or dialogue. I want to add a point to what our two colleagues had just mentioned about Ri's visit. I do agree that this was a chance for the North to again pronounce and to advertise itself as a nuclear weapon state to China and the international community. But in the grand scheme of things, it may be in line with Kim Jong-un's efforts to bring back some sort of normalcy to his state, a state that is centered around the party, particularly after the first party Congress in 36 years, and to normalize relations with other countries. So this may be conjecture, but perhaps against this backdrop, perhaps it was a chance for the North to gauge Beijing's willingness for a summit. Perhaps it was a chance to prepare for July next month, when there are a couple anniversaries marking their relationship. And perhaps it's also a way for the North to ask for Beijing's help in sanctions relief.
There are a lot of possibilities and a lot of different sets of interpretations that we can have given the very limited information that we have at this moment. But Mr. Eland, it seems that what you're suggesting is that this is going to be China's issue. And the question is, it seems that our South Korean panelists are trying to interpret in so many different ways to seek possibilities. The question is whether Washington is going to seek possibilities at all. Is Washington sincere in, let's just say, try to bring the situation into a kind of normalcy, at least to a certain extent, or Washington is more than willing to take advantage of this and therefore have its strategic plans implemented in Northeast Asia?
Well, I think the United States has become leery of getting sucked into negotiations which seem to reward North Korea's behavior, and if they're seeking some sort of relationship with China on sanctions relief, I wouldn't think that another nuclear test would probably do it. I think China probably does need to put more pressure on North Korea, but of course China is worried about if North Korea collapses, refugees. They're also worried about having a U.S. alliance on their border if South Korea should be unified.
But my question,
Korea should be unified under a South Korean government. So I think
Mr.
the
Eland,
United
once
States
again,
needs to give China some incentive to put pressure on North Korea.
What kind of incentive are you talking about? And may I just say my question once again very directly, that is, what actions and what incentives can be coming from Washington, D.C., rather than just saying, well, China, you are in a very awkward situation right now. Can the United States, in a way, do anything besides this already sanctions that's already agreed by the international community? Can something more constructive can be done at this moment, given it's the end of the Obama administration?
Well, I think we pay much too much attention to North Korea, frankly, and I think Donald Trump, actually, I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump, but I think he does have a point in that we really need to allow the countries of that region to deal more with North Korea. Right now, it's not really a threat to the United States. They may try to get the United States' attention, but I think we're foolish for constantly paying attention too much to North Korea, because it just allows them to act up to get more aid or whatever they want to do. And I think that the United States should give China more incentive to pressure North Korea by withdrawing from some of the alliances or downplaying them. And I think that these alliances are an attempt to contain China, and they're out of date. And I think the United States needs to reassess its alliances in East Asia with both South Korea and Japan and other countries as well.
Mr. Yang, here's the thing. What can China make of the latest situation? May I have you, first of all, related to that, respond to what Mr. Eland just said, that to give China more incentives, quote unquote, but you could also interpret it in more different ways, give China more pressure, quote unquote. That's one thing. And secondly, what does China make of, on the one hand, China has to work very hard in order to correlate all the parties previously involved in six-party talks to once again come back to the negotiation table. Enormous amount of preparation for that, of course, dealing with the DPRK. And on the other hand, be aware of a possible advantage taken by the United States of the so-called danger coming from DPRK in implementing its strategic plans in this region. So how can China play this both hands and also make sure, understand the domestic constituencies, taking care of the neighborly relations?
Well, it's a really big, complex question, and the answer is, of course, complex. But in short, China is seeking for an exit strategy for all parties. Now the situation is every party, the sixth party, all of us fall in the dilemma, fall in deadlock, and that's not what we want. So first thing first is we need to find a way to let all parties exit from the current deadlock so that we can return to the right track for the peace and stability and the denuclearization. That should be implemented by the dual-track negotiations, say, secret talks and talks on peace treaty or peace regime replacing the armistice.
Very interesting. Mr. Eland, I would like to, and together with Ms. Kim, to take a look at this piece that we compiled together about the sequence of DPRK developing its nuclear program, its missile program. In a way, it could be interesting to you, Mr. Eland, because it challenged your earlier statement about whether the U.S. has been too much involved on the DPRK issue. It probably suggests the other way around. Let's take a look at this. The DPRK has started its mission to master missile launch technologies back in the year 2006. Give some videos now. 2006 test fires a long-range Taepong-2 missile, which the U.S. said failed shortly after takeoff. 2009, Pyongyang launched a three-stage rocket, which the DPRK claimed a success. The U.S. said it fell into the sea. 3 years later, the DPRK tried the same type of missile but failed again. But the late 2012, its three-stage rocket successfully put a satellite into the orbit. By 2015, Pyongyang announced a successful launch of a submarine-launched missile, but many were skeptical of the claim. And early 2016, DPRK successfully sent a rocket into orbit. And the list could go on as we would understand. So, Mr. Eland, has there been much rather lack of presence of the U.S. attention leading to what we are having right now with DPRK's achievements of satellite testing and also of the nuclear tests?
Well, first of all, I think that Obama has made an attempt to not respond to these things as much and has been more reluctant to do the talks with North Korea simply because Clinton and Bush did too much on that, and I think they inadvertently caused bad incentives for the North Koreans to keep doing these things. So Obama may not be doing the right thing, but he's reacting to being leery of the North Koreans, what they've done in the past. So I think my own view is that that's the way to continue. But also, I think we have to realize that North Korea may have some security concerns, and I think they do continue this program because the nuclear program and the missile programs, because they're afraid of a U.S. attack. Now, that may be paranoid, but nonetheless, why make a paranoid nation even more paranoid? And they also like to do it because they like to get attention and get more aid when they do these things by misbehaving. And I think inadvertently over time, over a long period of time, the United States has inadvertently reinforced this type of behavior. And I think we really need to, disengage from some of these things in Asia rather than go all in. In other aspects, of course, the Obama administration has tried to pivot to Asia by increasing the military forces in Asia, and I think that's the wrong way to go. I think we need to let the countries of the region do more to deal with this on their own rather than jumping in all the time.
Ms. Kim, disengaged by the United States, has the U.S. been really quite engaging over the years when it comes to possibility of coming back again to the negotiation table, given the quite challenging circumstances? What is the views coming from South Korea? What can South Korea, alliance with the U.S. and Japan, really achieve?
Well, currently, as I said before, the position among all three parties right now, including South Korea, is on pressure, is on ramping up sanctions to try to change North Korea's behavior and to try to change Kim Jong-un's calculus. Now, on your question of whether the U.S. has been disengaged or not, I'd have to say that currently it's the North that does not want to engage in any sort of discussions with the U.S. Washington has attempted, has extended its hand, has asked for and proposed a discussion and dialogue, but the North is almost obsessed in Washington's view that these discussions can only be premised on discussions on a peace treaty, and that Washington needs to recognize the North as a nuclear weapon state, and Washington will not recognize the North as a nuclear weapon state. So the conditions for talks really is what is the biggest challenge right now.
Of course, the condition for talks has always been the deadlock. The question is, can people put that aside in order to really enter into a deadlock, in order to break the deadlock? That's all we understand understand over the years. Now, before we go, very briefly from you, Mr. Yang, what can be done now?
Well, all the related parties should increase exchanges and engagements between U.S. DPRK and China DPRK and vice versa. But the key words now is talks. In fact, both DPRK and U.S. want talks, but with quite a different subject. So we should explore our political wisdom to explore a way to bring about all together to talks on the commonly interested subject, basically peace and stability and denuclearization.
Well, we hope that will be the case. We hope different parties play their proper roles, at least making some efforts. Thank you so much, Yang Xiyu here in Beijing, and also Du Young Kim in South Korea for us, and Ivan Eland inside the United States. Really appreciate it for your perspective. Thank you so much, the three of you. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. A public uproar about ethical considerations in the death of an endangered gorilla shot after a 4-year-old boy fell into his enclosure at fault. That is a debate. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. It's International Children's Day today. As joyful celebrations are going on around the world, a tragic story in the U.S. Zoo may serve as a little reminder of how safely parents should guard their children. After a 4-year-old boy fell into the enclosure of an endangered gorilla in the Cincinnati Zoo this weekend, zoo officials made the decision to shoot and kill the gorilla to protect the child. The tragic incident has sparked a huge debate over animal rights. Before we go to our discussion, let's take a look at this story.
A 4-year-old boy inside an enclosure for a full 10 minutes, at times seemingly protected, at others dragged and tossed around like a rag doll by a 450-pound Western lowland gorilla before zoo officials made the difficult decision to put the animal down. And at the Cincinnati Zoo in Ohio on Saturday at the Gorilla World exhibit. The boy climbed over the barrier and fell into the enclosure of a gorilla named Harambe. The zoo said it had no other choice but to kill the animal.
We're talking about an animal with one hand that I've seen take a coconut and crunch it. He was disoriented. He never had anything like that going on. And that also led to the decision, of course, not to dart the animal.
The boy was taken to a local hospital after being rescued. A statement released by the family said he is now home and doing fine. But outrage has mounted among animal lovers over the tragic killing.
A fellow Cincinnatian who lived his life in captivity and through no fault of his own was thrust into a horrible, terrible situation. And he lost his life.
More than 300,000 people have signed online petitions to protest the shooting. Some urge police to hold the child's parents accountable for negligence, while others say the zoo should be fined for having an exhibit in which people can gain access to animals.
So it is clear that the Cincinnati Zoo, by not having sufficient enclosures which allowed this child to enter the gorilla enclosure, has violated the Animal Welfare Act.
Police are calling the situation an unfortunate accident, but have also vowed to investigate the incident. A handful of mourners have gathered for a memorial honoring Harambe, who lived his life in captivity and died at the age of 17.
For more on this latest discussion about the gorilla and the 4-year child, I'm joined here through the big screen by 3 panelists. In Los Angeles, we are joined by Ms. Julia Gallucci, who is with PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals. Meanwhile, in Boston, we're having Jeff Corwick, producer and host of The Ocean Mysteries, aired on ABC, and also author of many books on conservation. Joining us from London, we are having Gillian Miller, director of the Gorilla Organization. Welcome to the 3 of you coming from different parts of the world. How come this story has become such a big one? What are you reading out of this story, Ms. Gallucci?
Well, it's a terrible tragedy for so many reasons. I think mainly because this death was preventable. The mother should have been watching her child more closely. The zoo should have had secondary barrier in place to protect the gorilla from this kind of incident happening. I think everyone wants to assign blame, and that's been a big part of the debate. But I think that we should be looking at this as an opportunity to think about, in general, how we treat wild animals, why we keep them in captivity, and whether or not as a society we want to continue to treat animals like this and allow them to be in these kinds of situations.
Mr. Corwin, animal in captivity, there has been enormous amount of debates about that over the past few years. We understand this is a time for many of the zoos to re-streamline their services and also entertainment provided to the onlookers, and also as we also understand acrobatic groups around the world are now trying to get rid of the animal performance because of the rights of animals likely to be violated at the same time. So what do you make of this incident's eventual possible impact on all of these discussions?
Well, I really believe that this terrible tragedy is going to lead to a lot of soul searching. It was a gut-wrenching, heartbreaking moment. And just to be clear, Harambe, the lowland gorilla, did nothing wrong. It was just being a gorilla, and it found itself in this desperate, tragic situation. And I think this needs to be explored, and we need answers. With that said, to touch on what you just mentioned before, animals should not be in captivity for entertainment. There's been a lot of work to take them out of the entertainment, the film industry, the commercial industry, and there's a lot of effort to remove them from circuses and traveling road shows, and that is completely understandable and also ethical. Now, zoos have a primary mission for conservation. A lot of the work around the world, especially with gorilla conservation, happens at zoos. Zoos are also a biological bank for the future generation of securing species. We have species in the wild today, for example, California condors, black-footed ferrets, other species introduced back into the wild because of zoos.
Right.
China's program to conserve panda bears is based on part with partnerships with zoos around the world. So the primary mission of zoos is to educate people about the importance of wildlife and to provide resources to conserve wildlife. And while there are controversies with zoos, I firmly believe that it's very hard for us to truly protect an endangered species unless we have compassion and empathy for it. And we will not have compassion and empathy if we do not connect and understand it. And that's the role of the zoo.
And one of the critical things, Ms. Miller, if I could ask you your opinion, is the decision-making at the time by the zoo manager. That is, he believed that it is a choice between the life of a child and the life of a gorilla. And of course, as he did, he chose the previous one. But others argue that the gorilla just did what he did, just being a gorilla, even though he dragged the boy quite a few distance and banged the boy's head, according to the zookeeper, onto the hard ground, which of course make the child quite, in a way, in a dangerous situation. So the question on this issue is, at this critical juncture, what kind of decision should be made? Do they have the time to make the decision? When the decision is being made, what is the priority? Is it the human life, or is it the animal that is in captivity, or the animal that is in conservation? I think that is the issue to begin with.
I think you're right. We haven't seen all the footage. This was a 10-minute long incident, we're led told. It was a 10-minute long incident, and the film that we've seen is about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes long. What we're seeing is a gorilla dragging a child through the water. The child doesn't appear to be hurt. At times, the gorilla even appears to be perhaps protecting the child, some people have said. I think going back to the role of zoos, I agree with your last speaker about the conservation work that zoos do, but at the same time, they do put animals on exhibition for education, yes, but for entertainment as well. And of course, zoos are big business. That's how they can afford, in some ways, to be involved in conservation in the field. It is a very complex argument. Some people have said that there might have been other ways. Now, we don't know. I haven't spoken to the management of the zoo.
Right.
We don't know how many ways they tried. But we know that security forces, police forces have ways of immobilizing threats, people causing a threat without necessarily killing them. So were those methods tried? They say they couldn't have darted the animal, and I think that's probably true. A dart would take 10 minutes to work, and it could also shock the animal and cause a worse reaction. What I do know is that whoever, when they took this decision, and I believe it's in their protocols that they had to take this decision, it would have been absolutely heartbreaking for everybody involved.
I see. Ms. Gallucci, I think the issue is very interesting because, as Ms. Miller just argued, there could be other ways that used to, in a way, not killing the gorilla, but at the same time save the child. But the zookeeper was arguing that there's not enough time to exercise a tranquilizer, as he said, and with the use of tranquilizer, probably the gorilla could be even further stimulated in a way and show his anger toward the child. Of course, these are all very small details, eventually will lead to the result of the investigation we know is now underway. But now, here's the thing, once again, Ms. Gallucci, the priority is the most important thing. When it comes to the life of an animal vis-a-vis the life of the child, what should be the priority, even for animal rights people like you?
I think that, you know, we were not there. We don't know exactly what happened.
But when there's a choice like this, how should people make their choice? I think this is a criticalization of the specific question, it seems.
I think that the zoo, you know, they had a policy and they followed their policy. You know, as we've all said, you know, this gorilla didn't appear to be aggressive toward the child. As it's been said, he may have even been trying to protect the child. I think there may have been other measures that could have been taken, but when you're making a split-second decision like that, and this gorilla was in a high state of arousal, I think that even if the gorilla wasn't intending to hurt the child, because of their strength and because of his high arousal state, he could easily have injured or killed the child without intending to do so. We can't get into the mind of a gorilla and know exactly what his intention was. But the point is that this never should have happened. This gorilla should have been protected from this sort of situation. And I really believe that zoos should not count on the supervision of parents to ensure that a child isn't going to get into an enclosure, because ultimately the responsibility is with the zoo to protect the gorilla.
All right.
And that's really what I think we should be focusing on, is how can the zoo ensure that this doesn't happen again?
There have been a lot of different kinds of examples previously, but it seems that there has been a mixture, not necessarily going to help us to understand what kinds of methods we have to take under a very much a crisis situation like this. Take a look at this.
In 1986, a 5-year-old boy tumbled into the gorilla enclosure at Jersey Zoo in the UK. A male gorilla approached the boy as if to check on him, stroke his back. Startled by people's cries, it left and zookeeper saved the boy. In 1996, a female gorilla carried a boy to safety after he slipped away from his mother and climbed through a barrier at a US zoo. The gorilla carried her own 17-month baby while in contact with a boy.
So, Mr. Corwin, let me ask you once again, is this an issue at priority of the life of a human being vis-a-vis the life of an endangered animal? Do we have to make a choice like that? How much can a zoo do in order to prevent things like this from happening? After all, this zoo has been safe since the very start of this enclosure, 1978.
Well, that's a very tough question to answer. I'll tell you this. Lowland gorillas are one of the most endangered species in the planet, and they are in a lot of trouble. And their cousins, the mountain gorillas, are even more critically endangered. So we also have to look at these animals for what they are. They are magnificent. They are our cousins. We are primates, and the orangutans and the chimpanzees, and along with gorillas, we share commonalities. These are complex creatures with diverse arrays of behaviors, and just like a human being would have, we can see in these great apes expressions of passion, of altruism, of intelligence, of defense, of territoriality, which, just as with human beings, provides opportunities for unpredictability. But I believe, as it's been said here, ultimately it's the role of all zoos and aquariums to not only protect the animals that live there, but to protect the guests. And that's why I feel that out of this tragic example, there will be a long journey of exploration and heart searching. Now, as for the life of the child versus a gorilla, I can tell you this. I mean, I have a view that all life on Earth is significant, and evaluating one species over next is kind of through the human lens. We're all kind of Earthlings, correct? But then again, I'm a dad, and I have 2 children. And from my sort of selfish species perspective, the most important thing I got in the world are my 2 kids. Right. So it's a really tough thing to explore.
It's an absolutely tough thing to do, and especially for the zookeepers, because they have been dealing with this gorilla, their daily lives every day in a way. Ms. Miller, you are from the gorilla organization. I'm sure you've been doing many research about them. So are those zookeepers who have been with the gorilla for years, and they are holding a vigil tonight, I guess, inside their zoo to commemorate the death of this gorilla themselves. So this is once again a very tough choice. And may I clarify this choice? The choice is, what is the relations between human being and animals? I think that is a clarification that we need to understand this time, not only about the protection by the parents, not only about let's do the fences better, but rather what is the nature of relations between human being and animals? Ms. Miller.
This is a big ethical discussion.
Absolutely.
It's a discussion that we're just beginning to have, and tragic, horrible incidents like this are forcing us to actually look at these things. When we go back to what happened in the zoo, we have to remember it wasn't one keeper's decision. It wasn't one person who had to make a spur of the moment decision. The zoo would have protocols about this, and those protocols would be well documented to try their best in every way that they can to avoid that fatality, but in the last resort they were forced to shoot the animal. But there's another thing that we need to bear in mind here as well, is that these decisions are not just made on ethical grounds, they're also made on, I hate to say it, but on business grounds. The zoo is a massive business, and it's the start of the season, and I don't know, millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars are involved in what goes on in the summer in that zoo. The zoo, if it had a human fatality, that zoo wouldn't be able to carry on for the summer, presumably. So in actual fact, protecting the people who are its guests has got to be its priority. Again, like your other 2 guests here today, I just go back to that same position that if we are going to have animals in zoos, and that again, perhaps, we really need to examine that clearly. But if we are going to have these animals in zoos, then we absolutely have to have impenetrable barriers.
Okay.
The zoo has to protect the animals and the people.
All right. Ms. Corwin, before we go, I want to come back to you. This is a very important debate that we are having. It's not just about a child's life or the life of a gorilla. It's eventually about whether zoos and entertainment about animals should still be with us in a human society, and how should we deal with other species on the planet. Can we afford that world over? So Mr. Corwin, very briefly from you, your thoughts here.
Well, I believe that humankind has had a terrible relationship with nature and with species. Since we began crawling on this planet, we've been driving animals and life to extinction. And my personal belief is that zoos can be a catalyst where people can connect and learn about nature.
All right.
My own personal story, my dad was a Boston police officer. We lived in the city. When he went to work, he dropped me off at a local zoo, and it's that experience that drove me to become a wildlife biologist and work in the fields that I do today. So I think while there are lessons to be learned, I do think zoos, especially in urban places where city families don't have access to nature,
All right.
can be very important places.
It's a tough decision to be made then. It is also likely to be a continuous tough discussion we're going to have in the future. But thank you so much for the three of you for your perspectives and insights. Julia Gallucci, Jeff Corwin, Gillian Miller. Really appreciate it, the three of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.